Okay, folks, here we go. Another fantastic webinar from our friends UMass Lowell. Thanks to Ashwin Mehta and today Professor Michael Obal. We have this essays on disruptive technology adoption. Professor Michael Obal is an associate professor of marketing and entrepreneurship and innovation at the Manning School of Business at the University of Massachusetts Lowell. He holds a Ph.D. from Temple University. This is on innovation, business to business, marketing strategy, digital marketing. In the classroom, Michael teaches marketing analytics, new product and service management, customers and markets. With that brief introduction, I'm going to hand this over to Ashwin. Take it over, Ashwin Mehta.
Thank you, Dr. Vadulat, and thank you all for attending this webinar. Welcome to Global Entrepreneurship Education webinars. Our presenter, Dr. Michael Obal, will discuss relevant literature on the emergence of disruptive technologies and covers 3 essays on their adoption among businesses. The first essay examines the influence of pre-adoption buyer-supplier trust. Essay 2 focuses on the antecedents of quality adoption decision. And the third essay looks at the influence of employee motivations. So thank you for attending, and I will turn it over to Dr. Obal to discuss these disruptive technology adoption essays. Michael?
Great. Thank you for the introductions. Very much appreciated. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. So as Krishna and Ashwin mentioned, my name is Michael Obal. I'm an associate professor here at UMass Lowell in our Manning School of Business. And I'll talk today about a topic that I've conducted research on for several years now, and had some practical experience with as well before becoming a professor. Working in digital marketing and working sort of in this area where technology was rapidly changing at the time and really changing the way that people were interacting. And so, I'll give some examples of disruptive technologies to get a better understanding of this. And then I'll discuss some of my research. And I'll wrap up with some more recent research in the last year or two from other authors who are conducting research in this area. Because the interesting thing with disruptive technologies, there seems to always be something new that disrupts one industry or another. So there's always questions that come with these technologies when they emerge. So let me show my slides, and please, I'll obviously save some time for questions at the end. But please, if anything does come up, certainly. I'm comfortable with asking questions really at any time. So let's first start with a definition of what is a disruptive technology. These are technologies that fall short on mainstream product dimensions. And when I say mainstream, I mean the products that already exist in the market. They're often sold by new entrants, new companies in a given industry. They require the end user to spend some extra time and effort learning how to use the technology, which can be problematic. And the core value is not directly related to the value of the previous generation of technology. The benefit, though, is that these disruptive technologies exceed the dominant technologies on a few dimensions, and this ends up in the beginning being appealing to a few fringe customers. The benefit, the sticker here is that disruptive technologies do improve over time, and they actually eventually displace a dominant technology. So there's an opportunity here. Early adopters can displace the laggards. So you can think of the early firms that decide that they're going to launch these disruptive technologies. If they do it properly, they can sort of have a first mover advantage, if you're familiar with that concept. And depending on who the customers are, the customers in a B2B sense can also gain an advantage here. We have some prior examples, personal computers displacing mini computers, obviously several decades ago. Software as a service and cloud computing, probably about a decade ago or so, displacing traditional software. That's probably still ongoing, but I think we can sort of see now that that is in fact happening. And in emerging technology, I'll come back to this topic later, but what about blockchain? Blockchain is enabling the replacement of traditional currencies, maybe, potentially. Is this a disruptive technology that we're seeing emerging right now? We don't know that yet, because one of the tricky things with disruptive technologies is they're very difficult to predict when they're emerging. But certainly there are some early signs that blockchain and subsequent digital currencies, they do have some of the aspects of a disruptive technology. So we'll come back to that in a little bit. So when we talk about disruptive technologies, we should acknowledge that there are other incremental types of technologies. And you know, these are really the ones that you see more often. Slight improvements, and they generally require less new knowledge. You know, whenever there's a new smartphone that comes out, this is incremental, right? It's just a little bit of an update on what came before it, but oftentimes you know, a new smartphone includes features that customers had been asking for, and therefore is seen as a small improvement. Disruptive technologies, however, introduce new features that really require the user to spend extra time and effort learning how to use the technology. So I've got the example of when we went from CDs to MP3 players, and then of course eventually moved everything to our smartphones. There was a process. You know, we were no longer using these physical CDs. We now had all of our songs housed on one little device, and that that took some getting used to. It seems very intuitive now, but at the time that was a big shift for customers, and it does take time, but eventually we can look back at these sort of disruptions and say, oh, of course, MP3 players replace CDs. It's a better technology in many ways. So I'm going to focus this mainly on my research, which looks at disruptive technologies in a B2B space, and the questions that come along with this. Should managers adopt a disruptive technology? Well, they may yield greater results in the long run, but they also do introduce new risks. So should a firm adopt a disruptive technology, even though that can be difficult to predict, which will take off? Who should firms adopt the new technology from? As I mentioned, you'll have new entrants and you'll have incumbents that try to move into these spaces. And will employees willingly accept a new technology? This is sort of a key part of this in the B2B space that you don't see as much in B2C. And again, you're going to see in my slides that I've got some examples of prior disruptions. We still have paper maps, but obviously when we're driving, if possible, we'll use GPS now. So significant emerging technologies are easily seen after the fact, and companies are then congratulated or cascaded for their decisions to pursue them or ignore them. But rarely are the winners clear at the outset. Now, this quote is from 21 years ago, but I think it still certainly holds true, and I think there's a lot of lessons that can be learned from a quote like this and from the emerging technologies that they were referring to at the time. So for a company, making an adoption decision on an emerging and potentially disruptive technology is risky and generally quite difficult. So I use cloud computing as an example here. This is, some of these studies are from, I guess they probably span from about 2013 to 2018, I want to say, a 5-year span. But the good thing is, at the time I was conducting this research, cloud computing certainly had the signals and the aspects that look like it would be a disruptive technology. And I can say several years later that that's still certainly true. I think really all the things that we saw, and you can see in this quote from 2011, that cloud computing shows all the characteristics of a disruptive technology. 10 years later, that is absolutely true. We can look back at that and say, yes, that is in fact something that we've seen with cloud computing disrupting traditional software options. So should firms adopt? Well, software as a service is cheaper and more flexible than traditional software, but customers at the time were concerned about hidden costs. ability to meet technical requirements, and ease of integration with current applications. Again, I'm using software as a service, cloud computing as my example here, but we could use current technologies and we would sort of find the same types of issues. Should managers adopt software as a service? Well, should it be from an incumbent or a new entrant? So interestingly, we can look at some of the new entrants from that time. Salesforce, not really an incumbent anymore, obviously a very large company now at this point. But at the time, they were competing with these behemoths and Microsoft and Oracle. And it was, really, seeing Salesforce and another company maybe not as familiar with, Sugar CRM, they were emerging, but they still didn't have the benefit of these incumbents. And then will employees accept it? Employees might reject a newly introduced technology due to fear of the technology, implied changes to the work. Employees don't like change. And maybe even a perceived lack of fit. They might say, well, this is a cool technology, but it doesn't really fit my job. Now, this is especially true for Salesforce members. Someone's out on the road and they're in their cars all day, they're conducting sales meetings. They might not see a new technology as really being that important to their jobs. So in essay 1, we look at the incumbent versus new entrant question. And we look at the influence of pre-adoption trust on adoption intent. So if the trust is already built up between two firms, does that make a difference? Then we look at if firms should adopt. And so we focus on the antecedents of a quality adoption decision. In other words, not only should the firm adopt a new disruptive technology, but is it the right decision? That's why I use some prior examples, because it's not just whether or not it gets adopted, but it's also whether or not that technology is actually a good fit for that firm. And then will employees accept the technology? Again, this sort of 2 and 3 sort of go hand in hand here. It's not a good adoption decision if your sales force, for example, doesn't use the new technology. So essay 1, why do incumbents sometimes succeed? And we investigate the role of interorganizational trust on disruptive technology. Well, we find that new entrants, due to flexibility and opportunism, do actually tend to be more successful than incumbents with the introduction of a disruptive technology. They don't have the organizational inertia that a large company has. A large company, it might be difficult to sort of shift gears towards an emerging technology. For a smaller company, this is not such an issue. But some incumbents can succeed, and there's a reason for that. The reason is that risk of an emerging technology, while it's risky for the company, it's also risky for the buyer. So when faced with risk and uncertainty, what do potential buyers do? Well, we can go back to some of the psychology and sociology literature to understand this. And what we find is that when faced with risk, people become uncomfortable, they talk to other people, and they end up turning to their trusted friends and associates. This is no different than, in a personal situation versus even a B2B situation. So this is potentially good news for incumbents. They're likely to have higher levels of pre-existing trust because they've existed for longer. If your firm has worked with Oracle or Microsoft for a longer time, you might say, well, we'll just wait till they have a comparable technology and then we'll make the switch. The Xerox personal computer, this is a good one. They didn't have much success for it, but they certainly had they did have sort of a first mover advantage there. They just couldn't quite succeed with that. So this leads to the question, does pre-existing trust matter? It really shouldn't in this case. Disruptive technologies don't actually build off of previous technologies, or disruptive. So a really good example of this, Kodak. Kodak was very successful with traditional cameras, but they had a difficulty transitioning to digital cameras and to subsequent variations of this. And we see this. We see this with smartphones, actually, and I'll touch upon this later. But the companies who have been successful with smartphones were not the companies who were selling you flip phones 15 years ago. So this is a real trait of disruptive technologies, that while incumbent firms can succeed, usually what happens when there is sort of this leap from one technology to another, you end up seeing these new firms jumping in and being successful. So how can incumbents survive? Well, I conducted a survey with some information technology managers and took a look at interorganizational trust. So these are firms who have adopted a disruptive technology. And I asked them essentially, what caused their intention to adopt? Why did they adopt a disruptive technology? Well, some of the things that made sense, was the product easy to use? Was it valuable? Was it useful? That makes sense, right? If you're going to adopt any product, any technology, you should see that this product will be useful for a firm. It should be easy to use and relatively valuable. That all makes sense. What's interesting here, though, is that trust factor plays a role. What we end up seeing is that trust actually influences buyers' views of how useful or valuable or easy to use a product is. In other words, and again, to go back, it shouldn't matter. It shouldn't matter. These are different technologies, but it does matter. What buyers end up saying is that, even though this is really a different technology than what we've been using for the last 10 years, we're still going to rely on our trusted suppliers, our trusted tech suppliers, and that's going to influence our views of a new technology. So what does that mean? Well, intention to adopt disruptive technology is driven by how much the buyer trusts the tech supplier. So incumbent firms can actually take advantage of this, even though those incumbents tend to be a bit slower when introducing new products. So what can new entrants do, considering that the new entrants might not necessarily have this advantage of built-up relationships? Well, they can create strategic alliances. This actually works out well for both the incumbent. In this case, I'm giving you the example of Eli Lilly, and Galapagos, the emergent firm, creating a strategic alliance for osteoporosis treatment. And a big reason for this is that the one firm had the trust, had the long-term sort of reputation in Eli Lilly, but they didn't have the new technology. They weren't flexible enough to create this new technology. Galapagos had the technology, had the new treatment, but they didn't have the built-up trust. And so by creating that strategic alliance, both firms were actually able to benefit. Now, when you don't have that strategic alliance, it means that you have these smaller companies, this sort of David versus Goliath sort of issue where you have these small emerging companies fighting against these large incumbents. So buyers might be falsely associating the supplier's past success or lack thereof with the quality of a newer disruptive technology. If you want to think of this in terms of a B2C context, think about any friends who had their phones for a little bit too long. They probably did it because they trusted that flip phone. They trusted the company that sold that flip phone. But really, at some point, the smartphones were disrupting that industry. And, in a B2C context, you can just sort of say, well, okay, you have this old phone. That's not such a big deal. But in a B2B context, it can mean lost business and lost efficiency. So this leads us to SA2. How can buyer-supplier relationships lead to low-quality adoption decisions? So we're not just considering whether or not the adoption of the new technology happened, but is it a good decision? Buyers don't want to just, it's actually problematic for companies to just buy the newest, shiniest thing, because there's always something new and shiny, and they don't necessarily always succeed. So they need to ask, will the technology solve our current issues, and will we continue using the technology? So again, in high-risk scenarios, firms do turn to trusted suppliers, which can be problematic. They do this to improve because they believe it'll improve firm performance, reduce risk, lower transaction costs. That's actually still true, and potentially increase satisfaction with suppliers. But really, What it can also do, if you have that really trusted relationship, buyers will be less motivated to search for the ideal product. They'll become overly reliant on the suppliers. And this actually can lead the supplier to become opportunistic. Oh, don't buy this new technology. It's not useful. It's not for you. It's just a flash in the pan. That can be problematic in a B2B context where firms are always trying to find the most efficient, most productive technologies that they can. Furthermore, incumbents are often less successful, as I've mentioned. I've got the Apple versus Motorola example here. I'm sure many of you have Apple phones. I'm sure many less of you have Motorola phones today. And again, that's an example of that smartphone disruptive technology and sort of seeing that shift. So actually, for the buyer, interorganizational trust can be bad in this case. So this is a different set of respondents in this survey. And what I did is I asked 211 managers who had purchased a cloud computing package within the past 6 months, 6 to 24 months. So in other words, not just asking them, did they adopt, yes or no, but knowing that they all adopted and then being able to look back after some time to see, did they make the adoption decision? Did they adopt the technology that's most useful for their company? And there's a couple interesting findings here. So I'll start up top where we see things like searching efforts and efficiency motives and IT capabilities. I'll start with the green signs here. And what we found was firms that really spent some extra time searching and really getting to understand cloud computing and getting to understand what the different suppliers offered were happier with their decision, several months to 2 years, down the road. They also, if they were looking for the most efficient product, so efficiency motives, if they were looking for the most efficient product, again, they were happier down the road. And it makes sense. They wanted a product that would be useful and would save them time and money, essentially. Finally, if they had good IT capabilities, if they already had the ability within their house to essentially evaluate new technologies, that was useful for making the right decision. When do they make the wrong decision? Well, they make the wrong decision when they give in to normative supplier pressures. Those are pressures that are applied from a supplier to give into a certain set of norms. In other words, if you have a supplier of technology, of software, whatever it may be, and they're applying pressure to essentially do what's going, do one thing or another, that can actually lead to a poor adoption decision. The firm can end up adopting the wrong technology because they're listening to their supplier too much and they're not doing their own homework. What can cause those pressures? Two things. If a firm is trying to mimic their competitors, so mimetic competitor pressures, if they're trying to mimic their competitors, they're more likely to then turn to the suppliers, and that sort of leads them down this path of making the wrong decision. The other interesting one here is if they really trust their suppliers. So again, trust is built up over time. If a firm has built up a trusting relationship over time, they will trust their suppliers more and they're more likely to give in to their suppliers. The problem is that when new technologies emerge, it's possible that those suppliers who that firm has worked with for many, many years will not have the best technologies for that firm. When there's a shift in an industry, and we can use cloud computing as an example from, like I said, about 10 years ago, when there is that sort of shift, it's very often the case that your long-term relationships are maybe not super useful at that point. And really, that's when a firm needs to say, okay, we need to do this on our own. We need to conduct more searching efforts, and we need to improve our IT capabilities so that we make the right decisions for our firm. So these relationships do not have a consistently positive impact on quality of adoption decision. Trust can actually increase normative pressures and lead to lower quality decisions. And instead, firms, like I said, should increase their searching efforts. They should spend the money to develop their own IT capabilities at this point. Don't outsource it, and focus on getting the most efficient product, something that's going to save them time and money. That would be a major reason for adopting a new technology, because it is, in a B2B sense, going from traditional software to software as a service. Ideally, that's saving you some time and money. So then the final part of this is, how are your employees going to feel about a new technology? So if a firm brings that technology into the truth is, a lot of times employees don't have the option of really weighing in on that. They might be able to give their say here or there, but it's really the management team that's making those decisions, and that can be problematic. Individual goals might not actually match up with firm goals, and that's especially true in Salesforce. For sales teams that are looking to hit their monthly or quarterly quotas, they might not necessarily be super interested in spending time learning a new technology. So this could make, a disruptive technology could make sense in the long term, but there's a problem area because it's going to slow down employees in the short term. And salespeople, I can say this as a former salesperson, we don't like being slowed down. we know what our quotas are, and we don't like being slowed down and saying, you're going to have to take a break from hitting those quotas because we need you to learn a new system. So that's a problem area. So this problem area is related to this idea of goal congruency. It's a point of tension between salespeople and management. You can see my quotes here. They're from the 70s. This literature. This is nothing new, right? This is nothing new that the goals of salespeople and management, they tend to have some tension. At first it doesn't necessarily make sense because you think sales are sales, but salespeople are motivated to really focus on the short term. They're not really thinking 2 years down the line. That's not how those jobs are. They're focusing on the short term. Managers, however, are focused on the long term. They might be focusing on the overall health of the company. They might be, if it's a private company, they might be thinking about going public. That's a much bigger picture issue than, did you hit your sales goals for this quarter? Now, training can help with it, can help hasten the understandings of long-term goals. But again, this is always going to be somewhat of an issue between salespeople and managers. This is especially problematic if it's a disruptive technology. And again, if it's incremental, if it's going from version 3 to version 4 of a product, probably not a big deal. But if it's truly disruptive, then this could really cause an issue, because it could change the work process for the salespeople, for the employees, and that can lead to negative attitudes towards the technology and ultimately rejection of that technology. So predicting the applicability and subsequent success of disruptive technology is very difficult. Even if it makes sense long term, there's still going to be these sort of hurdles within a firm. So in order to analyze this, I turned to salespeople. I'd set up different types of sales technologies that have emerged. And this paper would have been finished in 2018. So it was technologies that were emerging at that time 3 years ago, and then comparing them also to incremental technologies. And what we were seeing is, when we looked at whether or not a salesperson accepted the technology, there's a few things we saw. If managers supported it, that makes sense. If the management team said you should accept this technology, then that was more likely to happen. Interestingly, individual sales performance motives. So generally speaking, if the more motivated, and actually I can say it for team goal motives as well. So the salespeople who were more motivated on an individual level and on a team level, they were more likely to accept the technology. So despite these goal congruency issues, salespeople generally are motivated to accept a new technology because they believe it can be applicable to them doing a better job. However, if that technology is more disruptive, this leads to this sort of negative moderating issue here that you can see, where what we're seeing is that as the technology is more disruptive, now we're seeing less of a motive to adopt that technology on an individual level. And it makes sense. With an incremental technology, as I mentioned before, this would not be a major, there wouldn't be training, there wouldn't be a major hiccup in that person's work processes. But if it's a disruptive technology, then that salesperson is literally being disrupted. Their job is going to change for a little bit. They have to learn a new technology, they have to learn a new process, and that's uncomfortable. And because of that, you can get this issue where if it's too disruptive, the salespeople might say, you know what, I've been doing it the same way for 20 years, I don't want to change, and I don't see the benefit of this technology. And that's where this becomes problematic. So there is really this gray area here when deciding, you know, yes, of course, a firm wants to be cutting edge and they want to have the best and newest and most efficient technology. But what management wants is maybe not necessarily what a sales force wants. And this is really a hurdle that needs to be considered when bringing in a new technology. So a salesperson can find a disruptive technology beneficial, but their individual motives to do well may negate their desire to adopt the new technology. And this is not what we found with incremental technology. So don't worry about it if the technology is really just, like I said, going from version 1 to version 2. If you need to update from one version of Microsoft Office to the next, not an issue. Like, we're used to that. But if it's really truly disruptive, that could be a problem. Having manager support is a big part of this. And there's a line of literature on what's called technology champions. These are people who really can communicate the benefit of a new technology to the firm and to the individuals within a firm. But interestingly, team and peer influences did not impact individuals when considering disruptive technologies. So it's not so much as to say, the team can lead it. It's not so much to say that someone is looking for an overall vote of confidence. What they're looking for is that there's one or two people who can really explain the benefits of a technology, and that has been shown to be beneficial. So if you think of training sessions, that it's usually led by just a smaller group of potentially technology champions. So here's what I've found in my research, and I'm gonna, on the next slide, go into some other research that is not my own, but ties into this. So I found interorganizational trust has a positive impact on the likelihood of adopting a disruptive technology. Because of it, it explains how incumbents can succeed. So that's why when you look at cloud computing today, you can see some companies that are, really just 15, 20 years old, and you can see others that are 40 years old. Then you can sort of understand how those companies can coexist, because you had sort of a mix at that time of emerging companies, and you had a mix of incumbents who were smart enough to move into cloud computing. Then the second essay, we found that interorganizational trust has a negative influence on the quality of adoption decisions. So keep this in mind. Relying on those incumbents when there's a technological shift can be problematic. And this is really when a firm needs to educate themselves on whatever that technology is. And individuals, employees, Salesforce, they are actually less motivated to adopt disruptive technology. So this is another hurdle that firms need to consider when bringing in whatever that technology is. So I mentioned that I wanted to discuss some other lines of research in this area that, again, are not my research, but I think really kind of line up well, and I think pose some interesting questions and sort of leave us at a good point as we get to the question and answer. So Frizzo and Barker from last year had a paper looking at the economic, legal, political, and cultural implications of blockchain, which is, as many of you understand, the underlying technology for digital currencies. So an example that they were curious about, they saw that IBM is urging British Columbia in Canada to use a blockchain-based supply chain to track marijuana sales. And needless to say, this is pretty interesting. You have a newly legal substance in Canada, although, this is, legal, but still, with some questions. And you have a major company saying we should use this emerging technology to track this. But of course, then you think, well, how does this benefit the government of British Columbia, who might be interested in the tax benefits that could come from marijuana sales? And also, what about the legal aspects? Blockchain has, and digital currencies have already become notorious for enabling criminal behavior. And so that becomes problematic as well. So it's a really interesting area where you have a major company like IBM saying, let's use this potentially questionable technology to track a recently illegal substance. So there's a lot of loaded questions in there. Love et al., also from last year, had a paper asking if disruptive technologies are too good to be true. So in their example, they looked at construction firms, and they looked at those who are adopting disruptive technologies to improve productivity and bottom lines. However, they also found that those firms didn't really understand them. So this is actually, and I don't know Love, but this one really ties into my research. So I should reach out to Love, and maybe we can do a research project together. But yeah, this is absolutely a concern where you have, especially in this case, where maybe you have we'll say maybe a traditional type of business, and they're interested in bringing in new technology and modernizing, but there are hurdles when it comes to understanding how those technologies can benefit them and whether or not they're really appropriate for all firms. And then Garlemich, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, but from 2018, had a paper looking at can disruptive technologies disrupt value chains for the better? They had a really interesting analysis. In their example, they were looking at 3D printing in London, and they were looking to see if that can offer a better use for plastic waste in the city of London. In other words, they were looking to see, with all the plastic waste in a major city like London, they were wondering if 3D printing would actually enable the recycling of that plastic waste, and then putting it to a better use than simply sending it to the recycling plant and using the traditional methods for recycling plastic when it can be recycled. With 3D printing, they were wondering, they were looking, well, maybe not only can we find another avenue for recycling plastic waste, but also maybe we can recycle types of plastics that we hadn't been recycling in the past. And again, that was based on looking at a potentially disruptive technology in 3D printing. And the key there, by the way, was, does 3D printing have enough of an adoption rate, and are enough firms using it in order to justify creating this sort of new value chain in which plastic waste is being then applied to 3D printing efforts? So just 3 papers I thought were pretty interesting and really borrowed from, really tied along with my research and tied along with sort of people like Christensen, who came way before me and started this long line of research in disruptive technology. So it's an interesting area because there's always going to be a new technology coming along, and there's lessons to be learned, right? When this started, the examples were looking at computers versus mini computers. Then, I've done research on cloud computing, and now we've got others who are doing research on blockchain and digital currency. So there's always going to be another technology that is potentially disruptive. And the issues we run into are, can we predict which ones are going to be disruptive? And when they are disruptive, what does that mean? How does that change an industry? And does it change an industry and perhaps a culture for the better or not? So I'll leave it there, and I'll open it up to everyone for questions, and I hope you've enjoyed the talk so far. Thank you.
Fantastic talk, Michael. This is really good, good stuff. And I'm sure everybody enjoyed it so far. And we have a whole bunch of people out there, and I'm going to request them to send in their text questions. But while we wait for text questions, we have some of our distinguished panelists here with us. Maybe they'll want to chip in and make a few comments. We got our good friend, Dr. Jack Wilson here, and then Dr. Yi Yang. So Jack, you want to jump in?
Oh, thank you. Are you able to hear me okay?
Sure, yeah.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure since I just had just unmuted. Anyway, terrific talk, Michael. I mean, this is kind of one of the interesting areas of kind of research and entrepreneurship as well, because the kind of the adoption of disruptive technologies has been so critical to to so many companies, and I think you really identified a lot of those issues very well. I was just thinking as we were sitting here, doing this webinar, even in this space, we have seen rather dramatic shifts. The first company to bring this kind of technology out was called iLink. The second one was Centra. Then there was WebEx. Then there was GoToMeeting. Then WebEx, kind of hung on, and then eventually Zoom came along and kind of blew everything away. And any thoughts about how the research tells you about that migration that we've seen over the last 25 years in these technologies? And kind of, did you see things in research that kind of explain the pattern of behavior?
So actually, the interesting thing, I hadn't thought about this, but yeah, obviously our lives have been disrupted as educators. And the interesting thing too is we were talking right before we started about the different systems, and Zoom. I guess we'll sort of think of Zoom as maybe more of an emergent firm, I guess, but Microsoft Teams, right?
Yeah.
They're the incumbent, and it seems like they sort of, I'd have to look into the motivation for them a bit more, but it seems like they sort of put it together pretty quickly, right around the pandemic, that they said, oh, we better start promoting Teams because we're going to get left behind. And so that's sort of an interesting one where you have a slew of really unproven firms or unproven brands, maybe that's a better way to put it, that we're trying to get into the space and trying to be, the leader in this sort of teleconference space. And then now, because of the pandemic, now you see Microsoft and some others who are saying, well, wait a second, we can do this too. We don't want to lose this business. So I think that's probably the question that pops to mind for me is, I think Zoom, obviously with the success they've had, they're going to be just fine. But I do think we're going to see some incumbents like Microsoft try to take back some of the market share from this, because they'll say, hey, this is something we can offer. And in theory, businesses will trust Microsoft more than some of these other brands and other firms.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jack. Thanks, Michael. You want to go to Dr. Yi Yang? Come in, Dr. Yang.
Oh, thank you, Krishna, and thank you, Mike. This is a great topic. Disruptive technology is always fascinating, and you have done a great job. Those are 3 S's are really interesting, and the findings are interesting, and also you raise very interesting questions in the end of your presentation, particularly, whether we should have a more disruptive technology or maybe too much. You asked the second question, right? Is it too good to be? Oh, well, actually, there's questions you asked about is it too much or right, less of the disruptive technology? The innovators face the dilemma, right? And sometimes, especially for the incumbent. But I'm thinking, in the global perspective, I ask this question, and if we put the disruptive technology in the supply chain setting, and the leader in this supply chain, if they bring too much, too frequent the disruptive technologies, it's kind of disrupted the whole chain, right? The supply chain, and the supply chain needs to be restructured, and it's put a lot of pressures to the upstream or downstream, collaborators along the supply chain. But on the other hand, it's also give the upstream or downstream collaborators the opportunities to kind of increase their technology capabilities, etc. But in the long run, is that possible? Those upstream or downstream collaborators could bring their own disruptive technologies and actually become like shift the leadership, along the supply chain. And I raise this question because I did see more and more challenges, like from emerging economies like China or India, especially China recently, right, along the supply chain, or even Taiwan, and because of the previously they, for example, Taiwan, the microprocessor chips manufacturers, long time ago they just supply, but now because of their technology already moved to the next level, they kind of become a leader, in the industry, in the semiconductor industry as well, and present a lot of threats to the incumbent and to the dominant players like Intel or AMD, etc. And do you have any further discussion, and maybe share with the audience and me what is the perspective about the, in a global environment, how this disruptive technologies impact the dilemma, in the global supply chain environment. I don't know, if I ask the question clearly. It's just, a very fascinating topic.
Hopefully, I got the point when you mentioned globally, and I think it's actually a good point, because I sort of didn't really mention. I sort of highlight some things in Canada and the UK here in these questions, but really I didn't really touch upon the global aspect here. But it's an interesting point, because I think this way, when we have American or really Western companies who, are, have become experts in a certain area and have become leaders in a certain area, you do get to a point where they can become complacent, and they, their customers become complacent. And really they sort of don't have as much motivation for change. Whereas in emerging countries, there is a lot more uncertainty. There's a lot more, but there's more uncertainty, but there's more potential, right? And so a firm who is looking at more of a sort of global customer base, I think they can have the opportunity to become leaders in a disruptive technology, because their customers sort of require it. And I think that can be where the opportunity might lay, is that, if a firm in an emerging area is sort of saying, what, we have to do things a little bit differently, and we have to be willing to take a few more risks, well, that can be bad in one way, right? Because risks can lead to, poor outcomes, or risks can also lead to really breakthrough innovations. So I think that sort of uncertainty that perhaps you're touching upon can be something that leads to an opportunity.
Great, thank you, Dr. Yu Yang. A couple of quick comments from Pravina, a couple of other examples, and Murugananthan. One, Pravina asked about Google Forms. What do you think about Google Forms? And then Murugananthan is saying, what about quantum computing? Where do you fit with these things and these innovations, disruptive technologies?
I'm not familiar with Google Farms.
Google
What was
Forms now. Google Form that people start using a lot. Google Form, the forms that they
oh,
use.
the forms.
Yeah,
Oh,
the form.
I don't know if that's disruptive, at least what I know from it. I would have to, I guess, do more research on it, but I don't know if,
Mhm.
I guess the question would be, does that really change someone's work process? And I'm not so sure based on what I know of Google Forms, if they would quite hit the mark of being considered disruptive. Because
How
that's
about quantum computing?
what's that?
Quantum computing? Quantum computing?
I'm not familiar enough to
All right,
speak to that.
fine, that's fine. We have a friend from Japan is again busy, Koki Fuji. He is a UMass MBA student based in Japan. Excellent
Welcome.
presentation, Dr. Obal. I would like to ask you about effective evaluation criteria in terms of disruptive technology development. I assume good companies understand the disruptive technology exploration would be one of the key R&D activities. However, it seems to be very difficult to evaluate researchers' performances with measurable metrics. Could you share the best practices of performance evaluation about disruptive technology adoption?
I don't think there's well, this is the challenge, and this is what makes it an interesting research area.
Yeah.
I don't think there necessarily is a guideline for this. I don't think, I mean, we've obviously seen a few companies that have come along, and maybe Apple's maybe kind of the best example we can use because they were able to disrupt, a few different product categories. So there's I think some lessons there, but I don't think there's necessarily a great guideline, which is what makes this so challenging, but again, makes it really interesting to research. I think one of the things, and I'll go back to my earlier slides here. Now, one of the things with disruptive technologies is that they don't initially appeal to everyone. And what that means is that the benefits are maybe not obvious to the mainstream right away. So I guess what you would be looking for is again, can you predict the future? If you're a firm creating a new technology, can you sort of see, well, we can take our current capabilities and create a new technology that we believe will be so beneficial in 10 years that it will completely displace what is being currently used. And I guess the other part of that is then sort of having an understanding of an existing market, an existing product category, and saying, you know what, what's out there now is not sufficient. What's out there now is not offering customers everything that they might want. I suppose we could look at electric cars as maybe an example of something that could happen. And we can sort of identify things like, well, the existing vehicles are not as environmentally friendly as some customers would want, and they don't get the gas mileage that some customers want. And so maybe that's a good example, is where we can see some obvious downsides in current vehicles, and we can see, okay, there's room for improvement here. And whether it's Tesla or whether it's another company, we can sort of see the beginnings of this industry being disrupted. But we also know that really electric vehicles, unfortunately, they're really still a niche product at this point. Get back to me in 20 years and we'll see if the disruption occurs or not. But that's probably a good example. If you can sort of think of that as your checklist of things to look for and to see, okay, this is an industry that is primed to be disrupted. Vehicles are primed to be disrupted. It's just a matter of actually accomplishing that.
Okay. Take one last question here from Muruganathan. Sure. He talks about blockchain. We have several platforms. How can we identify and ensure the quality and capacity of the provider?
We can't. Is the short answer. And this is a major issue with this because they're, blockchain and digital currencies. It's a a hot topic, and I think we, if we're honest, we can see some upsides to this technology right now, and we can also see some major downsides to this technology. And the question becomes, is this really offering something that in the long term the mainstream customer is going to give up effectively traditional currency? I'm a bit that, but that's essentially what we'd be saying is that, is there a path to go from appealing to just niche a small base of customers to a larger base? So I'll do a comparison of digital currencies and personal vehicles. I think with personal vehicles, even though we're not all driving electric cars yet, I think if we look at that, we can say, okay, we can sort of imagine how that might happen in 20 years, let's say. But if we're looking at digital currencies, there are still a lot of questions, and I personally would hesitate to say, well, will that get to a point where it will replace traditional currency in 20 years? I'm not convinced. And I think that's where this research in disruptive technologies is so challenging, because we can look, and I'm using two industries here, personal vehicles versus digital currencies. None of us know if either will really truly be disruptive and truly take over from what's already out there. But we can at least sort of say, it's like, well, one looks like it could get there, and the other, there's still way too many questions for us to say whether or not digital currencies will be truly disruptive and effectively. I mean, if you think about what a disruptive technology is, we would be saying that digital currencies would completely replace traditional currency. And there's just a lot of questions before we can say that that's going to happen.
Okay, on that note, back to Ashwin. Ashwin, come in.
Thank you, Krishna. Michael, thank you so much. It's a great presentation, great discussion. I'm sure we'll have you come back again next year maybe and tell us a little bit more about your current research on some aspects of this disruptive technology. It's a fascinating subject. And thank you for attending this webinar. Our next webinar is going to be on June 10th. And Dr. Yang, the co-director of the Center for Entrepreneurship and Department Chair of Marketing, Entrepreneurship and Innovation, we'll be talking about the corporate entrepreneurship and the recent trends in the corporate entrepreneurship. So please plan to attend the next webinar, June 10th. And if you have any questions, do send us an email at ge2@uml.edu, or go to our website, www.uml.edu/ge2. Again, thank you so much, and thank you, Krishna, for hosting the webinar. Thank you all.
Michael. Thank you, Ashwin, and thank you, everybody. And be happy, be healthy, be safe. Thank you, Jack.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Krishna, for putting this together, and thank you, Ashwin, for making it happen.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jim.